we've had to look at the theory of first-degree or perfect price discrimination. And what we've seen is that that allows the firm to capture virtually all of the consumer surplus. Let's think for a little bit about how first-degree price discrimination might work in practice and see if we can see some examples of how sellers attempt to carry that out. There's a prerequisite that's needed before first-degree price discrimination can even be attempted. One of the most important ones is that buyers cannot resell to each other. So, for example, you can't have a student buy, let's say, a cheap bus ticket at a student discount and then turn around and resell it to someone else who would have otherwise been charged a higher price. So the buyers who buy things must be also the ones who consume those goods or services. In order for first-degree price discrimination to be worthwhile and even workable, it must be the case that sellers have significant market power. So they must have significant control over their own prices. Otherwise, it's not really going to be worthwhile. Well, there are some practical problems. One of them is information. After all, how do we know what the maximum price is that someone is willing to pay? So the kinds of examples that we're going to consider are going to be ones in which either a lot of information has to be gathered or we need to get people to reveal how much they're willing to pay. An example that some of you may be familiar with is this kind of situation here. What we're looking at here is a famous souk or a market in Morocco, and this is a situation in which the buyers and the sellers haggle or bargain over prices. If you go into a market like this, you will find that there are no price tags on anything. You would have no idea what things cost or what the sellers were really willing to accept. The sellers, of course, are going to try and guess what the maximum amount is that you are willing to pay. So a central feature of this kind of market is really very poor information. It's completely different from the kind of environment that we're used to, where you walk into a store and there's prices on things. Okay, some of those prices may be negotiable if you go to buy a used car or something like that. But for the most part, the prices that you see are the prices that you are expected to pay. And here, of course, there are no prices. We could expect that visitors to this famous souk in Marrakesh, tourists, for example, are going to be paying far more than the locals will be, because local customers will probably go to the same seller. They will have developed some sort of relationship and understanding. The seller may well know that person, know something about their income, how much they're able to pay, and so on. An auction is another example of first-degree price discrimination. Let's think about how an auction of this type works. Suppose that you are in the audience here in this particular auction, and that this painting that is being held up is currently being sold. Suppose, given your tastes, your income, and everything else, you are willing to pay up to $200 for this painting. Well, logically, you should be able to be willing to bid up to that price and no more for that painting. The auctioneer, this fellow standing on the right, is going to be calling out prices, and those prices are going to be going up as various people in the audience here bid for the painting. Well, if you have enough people in the audience, and so you've got a reasonably large number of people interested in this painting, that price could be bid up until it ends up being sold to somebody for something that is very close to the maximum amount that that person was willing to pay. If that happened, that person's consumer surplus would be very small, perhaps almost zero. That would be a situation in which each of these items had been sold to individuals for virtually their maximum, the maximum amount that they were willing to pay. Well, that's really a case of first-degree price discrimination. In the last week of this course, we're going to be looking at different types of auctions and seeing how they work in terms of squeezing out consumer surplus. Let's look at another example. A famous kind of example of first-degree price discrimination are the tuition costs that private universities in the United States charge their students. This is a picture of Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, a famous old university. If you go to its website, you will see that it lists prices. Undergraduate tuition, this current year, is $53,430 US. And the cost for room and board and books is about another $20,000. If you wanted to be a graduate student at Yale, the tuition is $42,100. Well, those are the price tags put on these things, but what do people actually pay? If price discrimination is going on, then these are actually the maximum prices that anyone would pay. So, first-degree price discrimination takes place when the university decides to give what it calls financial aid to particular individuals. It may not give it to everyone, but it will select some students. Now, I should add here, of course, that universities like Yale and Harvard and many others are not necessarily attempting to maximize profits. Of course, they are trying to collect a lot of revenue, but they do have other objectives as well. For example, they want to have some smart students in their classrooms. So they don't want just people like this one here. If you recognize him, that's George W. Bush, a noted American war criminal. He went to Yale, even though he was not very bright. But he came from a rich family, and his father had also gone to Yale. Well, let's go to Yale's website, and we can read what they have to say. They say if a student is awarded financial aid, the Yale scholarship amount is included in their financial aid award letter that they would send you if you are accepted. And then they say that this Yale scholarship can vary from a few $100s to over $60,000 per year, and that the average needs-based scholarship a couple of years ago was $49,575. So we could compare these values with the approximately $73,000, $74,000 that someone would have to pay if they paid the full amount of undergraduate tuition and costs. So the decision about this so-called financial aid is really a form of price discrimination. You set a very high price. Some people you don't offer any aid to, but some people you give virtually a free education to. So virtually every single student who goes there could easily have been charged a different price. I might just add that what goes on in the background here is that the university collects a lot of information about you, tries to understand where else you've applied. Your parents would have to lay out their entire finances to the university so the university could get some idea of how much they were able to pay, and so on. So a lot of information is collected by the university to make this decision about how it's going to price discriminate. Well, let's have a look at a final set of pricing problems. What I want to consider is the selling of what are called perishable commodities. So a commodity that is perishable is really worthless past some certain point in time. You might think of fresh vegetables in the supermarket, for example, as being perishable. But so are plenty of other products. So the example I've got in the slide here is advertising in a particular hour for a TV broadcast. So if there's a particular time slot where advertising has been scheduled, it has to be sold before that time. Otherwise, it's just worthless. It's just empty space. So, for example, if you see a time slot that was not sold to someone else, you might see the TV network advertising one of their own shows or something like that, just filling in the space. Well, that minute of time could be sold at quite different prices to different buyers. Maybe the minute is split up into 15 or 30-second segments that may be sold to different people for quite different amounts of money. In general, this problem is called yield management, a phrase that is used in your reading and is discussed quite extensively in an example about airline pricing. Essentially, yield management is a set of sophisticated techniques that are trying to maximize profit contribution for these kinds of perishable commodities. And if you think about it, there's plenty of them out there. Ones that came to mind, things like hotel rooms, airline seats, spaces on cruise ships. You might think of package holidays that are sold by travel agents, bus seats, seats on a train, seats for a theater performance, concert tickets, things like that. For a lot of these things, marginal costs are typically very low. Almost all of the costs are fixed costs. And so what's needed is to essentially maximize revenues, to maximize profit contribution in some sophisticated way. What I've given you for an assignment is a reading where you can learn about and review some of these yield management practices and describe them to me in the assignment.